Welcome to the second portion of our conversation about the ethics of photojournalism. This time we're going to approach it a little bit differently, but I do want to give you the same heads up I gave you last time. This presentation will have images that are very difficult to look at. They will be um, violent in nature. They will be disturbing in nature. So please know that going into this presentation. Our last conversation about journalistic ethics in photojournalism was all about how to behave in the field as a photojournalist, how to emotionally prepare yourself for what you're doing. This is going to be different, though. This is about the aspect of deciding whether or not you should publish something. This is all going to be about the idea of deciding about putting the photograph out into the world and how you're going to do that. And once again, we are left in a very strange gray area. There is no absolutes here. There's no perfect way of deciding. All we can really do is look at past examples, look how they've been decided, and see if we can find some guiding principles from them. One thing we can use as a guiding principle is the Society of Professional Journalists, or SPJ's, Code of Ethics. One of their big ideas is the idea of, hey, journalists, reporters, photographers should minimize harm. And as a part of that, some of the language they use is that it should balance the public's need for information against potential harm or discomfort. Meaning that ultimately it's your call, but what you need to do is compare, hey, how important is it that people get this information versus how much is it going to potentially hurt people to get this information? And inevitably, conversations like this are always going to lead us to case studies involving death, involving dead bodies, involving people who've been hurt in violent ways. It's just unavoidable. It really does demonstrate the power of photographs and photojournalism. You can write a million stories about how someone was shot, but actually seeing someone who has been shot changes everything. Suddenly that becomes the big judgment factor. A front page of a newspaper, for example, will have a written story about a violent crime without even thinking about it. But the moment that you try to put an image to it, suddenly you have to have meetings, you have to have conversations, there's debate. And on that line, most sites, most publications, certainly anyone I've worked for, are going to have their own rules. Some of them are going to have rules that say you cannot have any bodies, dead bodies in an image. Some of them will have, hey, you can have bodies, but they cannot be identifiable human parts. So it seems like a strange distinction, but this is one that at a publication I worked at had this rule that a body under a sheet or a body in a body bag was fair game. You could publish those photographs, but if a hand or an arm or a leg was sticking out from underneath the sheet, for example, we would not use it. We would say no. That was an identifiable part. Some will have even stricter rules and say, you know what, you can't have any blood at all that will be in images that we'll publish. So part of these are sites, or part of these are publications that have long established their own rule sets. And so you need to think about people that you're working for, you need to know what their rule set is. But if you're going to be working on your own or going to be working freelance, you ought to think about which ones you are comfortable with. Which ones that you feel are going to allow you to live with yourself ultimately when all is said and done. A historical example of this that is really important is 1968. Robert Kennedy was running for the Democratic primary in the United States against what was supposed to be the incumbent Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson had dropped out of the race, and Robert Kennedy was making big headway. There was a lot of idea that he may have even if he would have been able to see it, would have actually won the primary. He was the little brother of JFK, the president who had been killed only a few years before this point. He was very, very popular in a lot of the United States. And then this is Boris Yaro. He's a LA Times staff photographer. He shot for the Los Angeles Times for a very long time. And he was there with Robert Kennedy the night that he was shot and killed. And he's the one that took the very famous series of photographs we're about to take a look at. And it was his decision with his editors about which photos are going to go out to the world, which photos they're going to publish. etc. The way the story goes, Robert Kennedy was doing an event in California, and a gunman approached him very quickly and shot him multiple times in the head and chest. And he fell to the ground. The person to the right in the photograph you're seeing is a cook. This was in the kitchen of a hotel, who immediately ran to the Robert Kennedy and started trying to help him, trying to stop the bleeding. This is a photograph just as it has happened. This is near immediately. You can see Robert Kennedy on the ground, and the cook trying to help him. And there was a question of, okay, so there's lots of photographs that Boris Yaro, the photographer, took. Which ones are people going to use to properly convey what had happened? Keeping in mind that culturally, the country at this point is only a few years separated from the president being assassinated. And so people are very on edge. It's only 5 years, like it says, 5 years after JFK was killed in Dallas, 2 months after MLK was killed in Memphis. And so everyone's very sensitive about violence, the portrayal of violence that's going on in the media and the world around them. And so there was a huge debate. Is running the photograph or multiple photographs of RFK, Robert Kennedy, dying, is that okay? Or ultimately, is publishing the photograph going to do more harm than good? Are people going to be more upset by seeing the image than they would be if they simply read the story? Would they get anything extra out of it? And sure enough, this will be a common theme here. Different publications did different things. And all of this has been a part historically of what we call the breakfast test. Newspapers publish in the morning and are sent out early morning to people. And the morning time, typically over breakfast, is when most people in the country read news at the most during the day and consume news, watch TV, etc. And so we call this the breakfast test. It's a thing editors have talked about for a long time, which is, are we going to upset people as they're eating breakfast, as they're reading the paper over the breakfast table, and that we need to abide by this rule. And so in order for you to publish something that would upset people over breakfast, it has to be an important cultural event or an important thing in newsworthiness value-wise in the country. And so, for example, the Los Angeles Times, the shooting had happened in Southern California. The Los Angeles Times actually chose not to go with an image that showed any blood. The way that this photograph of Kennedy is framed, you don't see the blood on his shirt anywhere, or blood from his head anywhere. It's sort of blocked by the gentleman on the left and the gentleman on the right. And so that is the way they went with it. They went a little bit more reserved. The New York Times did not. The New York Times ran with a photograph of Robert Kennedy with his shirt open, with doctors now around him. And although it's a little bit hard to see because this is a little bit blurry, just the scan of it is a pretty graphic picture. There's a considerable amount of blood on him at this point. And so the New York Times did catch a little bit of pushback from this, that it was not appropriate for them to run this particular photograph on the front page, because other photographs with less blood were an option. Finally, some papers, this is the Eugene Register-Guard, this is a newspaper out of Eugene, Oregon. Other papers chose not at all to even run a picture from the shooting. They just ran a stock photograph of Robert Kennedy when he was still in office, still as a politician, instead of running it in the shooting. Maybe this is slightly because they are a smaller town paper. They know they have a smaller community, a smaller sort of an audience not expecting something like that from them. So ultimately, they made the decision to not carry a shooting photograph whatsoever. So all three of them chose different things, and all three of them are remembered for the decisions they made. And if we can draw a conclusion from this, it's this, that monumentally historic events give a lot more room for publishing difficult photos, something that's got a dead body in it, people dying, blood, gore, etc. Because this was a monumental event. This was a hugely historic thing. This was a sitting politician in a decade full of assassinations. This was another politician being assassinated in public. This was the relative of a very popular president in JFK. The Kennedy family was very popular. And so this was a huge national story. And so if it was just any old person, they probably wouldn't run those photographs on the front page. The New York Times certainly wouldn't. But because it was a famous individual and because it was a national story, they did choose to. Let's look at another example, another one that makes this tricky. This is an example from the mid-90s, April 1995. A domestic terrorist named Timothy McVeigh built and detonated a bomb in the back of a truck in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. We know it now as the Oklahoma City bombing. When I first started teaching about this, I realized also nowadays that a lot of you in the audience here, my students, don't know a lot about this event because this happened before you were born. It isn't something people talk a terrible amount about. But it was a huge deal for those of us who were around when it happened. It was a really huge, terrible disaster. 168 people ended up being killed when all was said and done. It was a sort of groundbreaking event in terms of nothing like this had really happened in the United States up to this point. 9/11 would sort of change how we perceive terrorism, but in the United States before that happened, this was the very shocking thing that told us a lot, in many ways, that the world was and could be a dark place. But in the journalistic coverage of this event, there was a situation where a firefighter by the name of Chris Fields for the Oklahoma City Fire Department pulled the body of a dying 1-year-old child from the debris and scooped the child up and walked them over to a police officer to hand them over. And the series of photographs became incredibly famous after they were taken. So the photographs are in the next slide. They are graphic. I just want to give you the heads up. This is a photograph of Chris Fields holding the child. This is a little bit of a wider shot, not cropped as much. And then this is the photograph of the firefighter handing the child over to the police officer. By the time he had handed the child over, the child had passed away. These are very powerful photographs and ones that were used a lot in press coverage afterwards. Now, where they came about actually is not from a professional photographer. It was from a guy named Charles Porter IV. He was an amateur photographer. He just really liked the idea of photography. He thought it was cool. He wasn't even freelance. He wasn't selling his images to anyone at that point in time. He was working as a clerk at a local bank when he realized what had happened down the street. He got his camera and went to the scene in order to take photographs, take pictures. This is sort of a snippet I pulled from a historical piece looking at the history of these images. And it says, the tragedy took place before the age of cell phones and instant cameras, and Charles Porter IV took his photo to a nearby Walmart to have it developed. A friend, moved by what he saw, encouraged Porter to submit it to the Associated Press. Porter thought the local paper might run it. Instead, the image traveled around the world. So he took these photographs and then got them developed at Walmart, at the Walmart photo counter. And he wasn't even convinced anyone would want the pictures. He ended up, selling them, giving access to the AP, and then these ended up being some of the defining photographs of this entire terrible tragedy. But once again, once publications got a hold of this picture, or those couple of pictures, there was huge debate about what to do with them, because it was a very graphic picture of a child dying. And so what do you do? And a lot of papers actually chose either to not run it or to run it in very small print. So, for example, the Daily Oklahoman, the daily newspaper out of Oklahoma City, they ran with just a general picture of the blast site where the bomb had gone off with the headline, Morning of Terror. Now, if you notice at the bottom, below the fold of the picture, they actually do run the image. But they run it in very small print. They run it where people wouldn't see it on the newsstand if it was just stacked up there. And they ran it specifically with the story indicating that one of the parts of this tragedy that made it extra terrible is that the bomb went off right next to the daycare center of the building. So many of the victims were children. The New York Times did the same thing. They ran a similar picture, another one of his pictures, although it was of a different angle. But they ran it below the fold, so that if the New York Times was on a newsstand, you would not see that picture. You would have to pick the paper up and unfold it to see it. They ran with a general picture of the blast on the top. And the Detroit News, another example that did it in a very similar way. They used the same image as the New York Times above the fold, and then they used the more classic of the photographs of the child below, on the bottom, below the fold. And notice in this copy of the Detroit News, you can actually see where the fold in the paper was, so that you would have to pick this newspaper up and open it to see this picture. Some papers, though, decided not to run it at all. The Sacramento Bee, which is the daily newspaper out of Sacramento, California, at the time decided we're not going to run any of those photographs at all. We'll run pictures of the blast, but not of the firefighter holding the child. The editor at the time gave this quote, which is, "We viewed it as a picture of a corpse, even though there was no information about the baby's condition. It was the most dramatic photo and very compelling, but we chose to go with a photo of a live child rather than a dead one." So they ended up using a photograph of a child who had been rescued from the rubble, as opposed to the famous photograph, because the famous photograph included a dead body, because the child had died. Some publications didn't approach it with any taste whatsoever. So the New York Daily News ran the photo without the firefighter in it when they zoomed in very incredibly close with the headline, "They blew up the babies," which was pretty distasteful, and they got into a considerable amount of ethical trouble afterwards. People were upset with this, that they would zoom in so much on this one particular photograph. Of the magazines, back in the 90s, news magazines were still very popular, a little bit more than they were now. Time magazine ran the photograph on the cover, but in a little tiny box next to an image of the suspect at the time that the issue had come out. The suspect had been caught, Timothy McVeigh. So they ran it in very small print. Newsweek, however, didn't. Newsweek took the other approach, and their cover for the entire incident in Oklahoma City was that image. They zoomed in on this. They also didn't use a headline. There's no text on the cover except for the name of the magazine in Newsweek, and they just simply labeled it at the top, Oklahoma City, April 19th, 1995. They actually successfully, I think, used this picture. I think if you're going to use it and you're going to bring people's attention to it, this is how you do it. You don't use a headline. You let the picture speak for itself. At this point, everyone knows what has happened because this is a weekly magazine, so it's coming out a little later. And ultimately, this ends up being the thing people will remember. It's not distasteful in any way. I think it is hard to look at, but the incident was a hard one to stomach. So it does convey a sense of what happened appropriately. The photographer of these pictures, the ones that would become incredibly famous, ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize in 1996 for spot photography, which, again, was kind of an amazing thing because they were not a professional photographer. They were working at a bank at the time. Ended up being someone who would not necessarily realize the extent until a little bit afterwards of just how famous their picture, their handful of pictures was going to get. I've never really been able to successfully find what they did after they won the award. I know they stayed in photography for a while, but I don't really know if they opened up a photography business or got employed somewhere doing photography. I don't know. I have yet to find something. But the conclusion is this. When you're dealing with a very emotionally sensitive photograph, something that involves death, or a very emotionally difficult time, the context of how it's used and the taste of it are going to be incredibly important. There's a huge difference between how the New York Daily World used the image very cropped and zoomed in versus how Newsweek did it, very cropped and zoomed in. It was how they zoomed in, it was what they zoomed in on, it was how they used headlines or didn't. So if you're going to use an incredibly difficult photograph, consider how you're using it. And with that, I think oftentimes less is more. It ends up bringing us to a contemporary issue here. We are facing the exact same issues now that we were facing in the 90s, that we were facing in the 60s. Ever since photography has gotten big, we've always had questions about what to do with difficult to view images that often involve death. So the contemporary example, a really good one here, is there was a story where about 12 refugees coming from Syria, coming over from the Middle East, were attempting to cross the Mediterranean to a city in Greece. A good number of them drowned after their raft sank, and the bodies of those who had drowned washed up on shore. The next image is one that a lot of people were trying to figure out what to do with. Just as a warning, this is a difficult photograph to look at. So it is the photograph of a child who was on the raft, who had drowned in the sea as the raft had overturned. The child's body had washed up on shore, and the police were trying to record any information about what had happened. So there's a police officer there taking notes to the right. And the drowned child is lying face down in the sand. This was accompanied with another photograph too, which was the photograph of the police officer once he had picked the body up and was walking the body away. So the photographs actually came about first on social media. Before traditional news started picking up on them, it was because a lot of smaller news publications, and really only smaller news publications, were covering the refugee crisis. This is before it was a big national thing. And so now, as this photo starts to get popular on social media, and as the story of the refugee crisis gets bigger, major publications are left with a very important question, which is, are you going to run the more jarring photograph of the child laying face down in the sand, or are you going to use the slightly safer, more conservative one where you can't see the child's face, it's obscured by the policeman's body, or do you not run anything at all? Now, some publications like the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Baltimore Sun, they opted for the slightly more reserved photo, the one where you couldn't see the face. They decided to use that one. But not everyone did. The Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Globe and Mail, which is a major news publication up in Canada, decided to run the full image, the one of the child face down in the sand. And I think an interesting thing here is this isn't drawn across lines of major publications versus small publications. The LA Times and Washington Post are big papers. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal are big papers, yet they approached this challenge differently. This is a quote I like about the situation from Kim Murphy, who was an editor at the Los Angeles Times when this was happening. And the quote says, "The image is not offensive, it is not gory, it is not tasteless, it's merely heartbreaking, and a stark testimony of an unfolding human tragedy that is playing out in Syria, Turkey, and Europe, often unwitnessed. We've written stories about hundreds of migrants dead in capsized boats, sweltering trucks, lonely trail lines. But it took a tiny boy on a beach to really bring it home to those readers who may not yet have grasped the magnitude of the migrant crisis." So this is them admitting that they've written stories about this before, but it hasn't hit national attention yet. It was the image that got people to pay attention to it. And so it's them understanding and embracing the power of photojournalism, the power of what a picture can do. Interestingly, two publications that were online only took drastically different approaches to it. BuzzFeed News and Vox being the two different ones. BuzzFeed opted for publishing the photographs and Vox didn't. Max Fisher, who was the editorial director of Vox Media at the time, said this quote about it: "I understand the argument for running the photos as a way to raise awareness and call attention to the severity of the refugee crisis, and I don't begrudge outlets that did. But I ultimately decided against running it because the child in that photo can't consent to becoming a symbol." So their idea was that there was a level of consent necessary that just wasn't there. Some publications did this as well, and there were some questions about this, of running the images with the child's body blurred so that you get a context of what the photograph actually is without having the full impact of the sort of horrificness, sort of immediacy there. Some publications who did it this way had a way that you could click to uncensor it, so sort of putting it behind a wall. And that's what the CBC did, the Canadian Broadcasting did, one of the major news outlets and major news websites in Canada. They actually put it behind a thing that said, a site that said, hey, you have to click this before you can look at this picture. And they ran it with the warning, editor's note, graphic warning. This story contains 2 graphic photographs of a young boy who died, images some viewers may find disturbing. They are embedded at the bottom of this story after the last paragraph of text. CBC News has decided to include the photos to allow for the fullest understanding of the event, but we do want to give readers the option not to scroll down and click away if they don't want to see them. So they very clearly up front said, hey, these photos are here. We want to give you warning. We want to make sure that you understand what you are going to be seeing. And I think when you look at the different ways that this got published, the different ways that people decided on this, one of the major conclusions to find here is that consider that, hey, if you're going to have graphic photographs, warn people about it. Give people a content warning. Put them beneath the scroll, so to speak. So put them in a way that, hey, when you find the story online, you either have to click something in order to specifically see it, or you warn people that it's going to be down past where the story ends. You give people the ability to choose for themselves if they're going to see it. Kind of in the same way that newspapers, when we think about the Oklahoma City example, put that very hard to look at photograph beneath the fold. Now some didn't and were either praised for it or were sort of attacked for it. But either way, some didn't, and it worked for them. But I think a really good lesson here, and I think my personal belief is that if you're going to show graphic images, you should warn people first. So that's part 1 of our ethical conversation on publishing photographs. We will pick this up on the other side with another example of deciding when and how to run a difficult photograph.